This is the beginning of this week, which is really just this weekend and Friday, Saturday, Sunday next week, in which we celebrate this extraordinary part of the life of Christ. Jesus, at his birth at Christmas, we all know and rejoice and do so many enjoyable things, spiritual and social. But this period of Easter is something altogether else, because both of the glory of it and the grief, and it brings us into a much more serious relationship with the intention, the effect, the reality of the life of Christ. I'm going to, of my own free will, bring up the subject of free will, which all of you who come often may know how little I like to discuss this point because it becomes so complicated so quickly. But oddly enough, it seems integrated into what we're talking about today. I'm in the very early stages of writing about Swamiji and the role he played in the development of Ananda. To say that I'm writing a book is not yet true. To say that I intend to write a book is what's happening. And as a consequence, I've been searching through many, many pages of notes that I have collected over years. In the very beginning of Ananda, 1967, 68, 69, before Swami Kriyananda had written any books about Master at all, he only had the commission from his guru to do it, and his own notebooks full of notes. He started something, and this gives you an idea of inflation. He started something that was called the $1 a month club. This was to raise money to buy the land that is now Ananda Village. And he would mimeograph on two sides of an 8.5 by 11 sheet sayings of Master that had never been seen by anyone or were not published anywhere out of his notebooks. It was the beginning of him, which later became the path and the essence of self-realization, conversations. And you would get one in the mail, and you would have an address, because I got them in San Francisco. You'd have an addressed envelope, and you had to pay for the stamp yourself. You'd get the writings, you'd put a $1 bill in the envelope, and you'd mail it back, and the next month you'd get one. And in this way, he made a few $100s every month, which was helpful. So I don't have a complete every month of those, but I was reading through virtually everything that's there, subsequently been published, except for one concept about free will that I'd never read before. Sorry, my throat is always rough when I start. And he put it this way. This is the very interesting way he put it. He said, a tree stands and grows somewhere. You see it growing there. But it was placed there. It did not have any choice about where it was going to stand. Human beings, most of what a human being does is predestined not by a fate, by a force other than ourselves, but predestined by all the decisions that we've made up to that point that have set a certain momentum in place that limits us. He said, but there is also a little bit of free will. And then he said, only the very wise can discern what is free will and what is predestination. I love that, because you see, that gets me completely off the hook. So I have emblazoned this in my memory so that the next 300 times I'm asked how much is predestination and how much is free will, only the wise can discern. I can say. So what does this have to do with Palm Sunday? Because I really want to bring us into that conversation. I'm sure many of you, to varying degrees, have some sense of relationship and identification with Jesus. Some of you I know have a very deep sense of identification. I started studying the life of Jesus, the Bible, the Master's interpretations of it, after I came to Ananda, because as most of you know, I was raised Jewish, and I was raised neutral, fortunately. I didn't have an aversion to Christ, as some Jewish people grow up with, which is really more an aversion to being persecuted by Christians. But unfortunately, it translates over. And I was just neutral. So I just started from zero and was able to understand it through Master's eyes. And then all these years of being here for Christmas, being here for Easter, having to try to recreate it, I've come to believe on a deep level that somehow I was on those streets of Jerusalem. In what capacity, I have no idea. It's either because of so much concentration on it over the years, or it's just a memory. But what that means to me is that it's not a story. And the more one lives on the spiritual path, and the more one lives in a longer rhythm, just as Tandava was reading today, Jesus walked and talked and laughed and ate and slept and all of the things that a normal human being does. But the consciousness within that body was of infinity. And although it's not so simple for us to just say, oh, therefore, oh yeah, infinity, yeah, gee whiz, infinity. But we all can tell that even in the course of our own incarnation already, and certainly among the people we know, many people experience things differently, depending on their perspective on it, on their understanding of life and death. At one point I was invited to be present when the husband of a member of our congregation here, he had become irrecoverably ill, if there's such a word, terminally ill, that's what I'm looking for. And he had been placed on a life support system, and they knew they didn't want him to stay on that. He wouldn't have wanted it. So at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, his life was going to end. And they invited me, they wanted me to be there. I think the man who was dying and I were the only ones in the room who weren't absolutely freaked out by what was about to happen, which included all the doctors and all the nurses. Shanti has informed us how little conversation there is about death in medical school, which is really quite astonishing when you think about it, but that's a whole other conversation. But there we were in that room, and he was very calm. He had been unconscious up until then. Now he's wide awake. We're all looking at the clock. Imagine. But there was complete calmness in his eyes and total acceptance. His consciousness, of course, by the grace of God at the end, was somewhere else. And mine was too. Hardly in eternity, but really not where any of those doctors and nurses were. Same experience, different perspectives. If you can see gradations of consciousness at all, then the question is, what is the upper limit? And the scriptures all tell us there is no upper limit. As Master said, evolution continues until we achieve endlessness. And so that's where Jesus was in all of this. Now coming back to free will, predestination. This story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem is such in itself just a magnificent tale. The historical and spiritual context, Jesus had a 3-year mission. Of course, the middle years of his life are taken out of the Bible, and much that makes the story, it's fragmented the way we see it. And so we have to fill in with our own intuition and our own natural understanding what it really was. But Jesus came to do battle. And Swami Kriyananda has asserted on several occasions that it was his increasing belief as his life went on, and he was more and more willing to state it, that Yogananda himself had incarnated as Jesus. This was not something that Master himself said during his lifetime. He didn't refute it, but neither did he assert it. As Swamiji said, it would have so confused things that Master would have been able to deal with nothing else but that issue. But the point is this. Swamiji said the personality of Jesus was the personality of a warrior. And Yogananda lived as William the Conqueror and as a king and a general in Spain. And even as Yogananda, he came to hostile shores. He came to a completely materialistic country that knew nothing about the teaching he came to bring. And he did battle with narrow-minded prejudice. And there were many occasions in Master's life when he was deeply subjected to prejudice and persecution. Those incidences are told in Swami's biography of him, but not in other places. He was a profound challenge to the status quo in many ways, not the least of which we don't think about, is that he was a dark-skinned man at the time when segregation was still the law. And in fact, when he was in Florida, they were going to arrest him for holding interracial meetings. And he just, as he put it, wiped the dust of the city of Miami off his feet and just left town. And in Washington, D.C., he had to form two groups. There are these marvelous pictures of the, at that time, it wasn't called African American, but the African American self-realization groups. And Master, of course, looked like he fit in there rather than in the others. You know, we don't think about these things in our times. But he did battle. And he did battle without the slightest hesitation. Now, Jesus lived in a much less enlightened time than ours, on every level. It was deep in Kali Yuga, a much less enlightened age. And when he came to say, God is a God of love, and he is your Father, and you may have your own direct relationship with him. It's the same, interestingly, the same message that Yogananda brought. But what Jesus was fighting, and realized the whole battle took place entirely within the Jewish community. The Romans were only concerned about insurrection. They didn't really care a whit what Jesus taught. They were pagan in the sense that they didn't understand the true nature of reality at all. They were with nature spirits and various gods who were anthropomorphic entirely, and they had to propitiate this one to get that one and propitiate this one to get that. It wasn't that it was entirely false, it was just a much lower teaching. And the fact that Jesus totally repudiated that, they didn't care. The people who cared was the establishment of the Jewish religion at that time, because they had it all worked out. And their system, their ways, their pocketbooks, their payments, their power was completely threatened by Jesus. Jesus said, I am the incarnation of God himself. I am the Son of God, and so are you. And as the Son of God, what need do we have for the priests? What need do we have to spend all our money to get the right offerings and then pay the priest to make the right offering for us and then wonder whether or not we're good enough? Jesus just completely repudiated all of that. And power does not give way lightly. That is one of the great delusions of life, power and money. So the battle wasn't really even about Judaism. It was power and money versus freedom. What Jesus offered was freedom, freedom of the spirit, freedom of the heart, freedom from this oppressive dependence on the authority of others, the security of money. In the Bible, in fact, when the rich man comes and says, how can I follow you? And Jesus says, give away all your money first. And it says, and the devotee went away discouraged because he was a very rich man. You know, become something else. Become one with the Spirit. That's what was being asked of them. Now, this is not an easy teaching for any of us. When Kamala de Silva, Kamala Silva, who was a direct disciple of Master, she had some very great difficulties at times in her life. And when we were early devotees, it was nosed about that Kamala had prayed to Master that she be allowed to work out all her remaining karma in that incarnation. And we would have discussions about who had the nerve to pray that prayer. It's no small thing to ask yourself that question, because we get emotional and we say, oh God, anything you want, I'll do anything you want. But you can sort of hear Master on the side saying, just quietly, anything? And then it's nothing to be ashamed of. But it's necessary also to know where we stand. And to know, actually the way I think about it is, we need to work out our own karma, not somebody else's. It's very dramatic to try to work out the karma of the one who's almost free. And then to rant and rail in front of our altars, "Oh Lord, anything you ask, anything you ask." Very carefully not looking at what he's actually asking, like this. But in any case, at the time, this was a huge conflict. And Jesus came, he was 3 years back in his home country. Prior to that, Master said he was in India, preparing for this mission, and teaching and preaching there. And then he came back to fulfill the cause for which he was born, because he was the avatar and the Messiah for those people. Those were his disciples, that was his group, and that was his destiny. And he just continually confronted that power structure to the point of going into their temple and throwing out the money changers, just trying to completely change the reality here, and publicly challenging all their teachings and mocking them, and talking about how they just were there. They were really just there for the power and the money, and he was there for God alone. And we like to think, oh, I would have recognized Jesus and gone and stood with him. But would we? When all the force of tradition, all of the society, all of the seeming ability to make or break the success of our lives is on one side, and this one radical individual is on the other. And that's why the whole experience of the disciples with Jesus was always had to be an internal one. And he was often challenging them in that way, epitomized by the question he asked Peter when everyone else was leaving him, "Will you also leave me?" Jesus was not as he is now, when it's just really easy to be a Christian. I don't mean easy in your own heart, but socially. Nobody's life is at stake here. Nobody's social position is at stake. Nobody's harmony in the home is at stake. The wife becomes a Christian and the husband resists. The daughter becomes a Christian and the parents are dismayed. The grandmother becomes a Christian and they want to hide her in the house, because nothing was supporting that. And Jesus was consciously creating the moment of absolute confrontation. And he was taking those disciples who were with him. And this thought of free will, which is only peripherally involved here, I was trying to imagine what it was like. You see, we're all on a thread with the divine. I had an odd experience once, many years ago. It must have been in the 70s. And I had been doing a great deal of work and working very hard at Ananda village, and then I went to visit my parents for a few days. And I rarely become ill, and I've only had a fever a few times in my life. But I became very ill, and I got a very high fever when I was staying in my parents' house. And whereas I usually only stayed a couple of days, this was in Southern California, and I lived in Grass Valley, I had to stay about 5 days because I was just so sick I couldn't leave. And when I was slightly better and able to get out of bed, and I remember I was so ill and I wasn't eating. My mother didn't have any understanding of fasting and became very alarmed. She really wanted me to eat, and I vividly recall saying, "Bring me a strawberry." I carefully ate one strawberry, which felt to me like this huge meal. This just gives you an idea in retrospect where my body was. So I'm sitting there in the last few days of recovery, and I'm just sitting on the couch as families do. You're all lined up like birds on a wire, and you're all looking at the television. So we're all lined up at birds on the wire, we're looking at the television. My parents are sitting next to me. They didn't actually object to Ananda, but they didn't like it much either. They thought it was a phase that I would grow out of. I was still in my 20s, so they still had hope. They lost hope as time went on. So we're all sitting there, and just wildly out of my mind, these words started coming to me, that I could turn to my parents and say, "I think I won't go back to Ananda. I think I'll just stay here and get a job." And I could feel that if I said that, my parents would say, "Yippee!" like that, I'd live closer to them. They would be happy. It was over. And it was like a temptation that was rising out of me. And I knew that my parents would cheer, and there would be, incredible discombobulation at Ananda if I just called up and said, oh, by the way, I'm not coming back. But my parents would be happy, Ananda would be dismayed. It's just like, it was right there, the two realities. And I could feel that there was a thread from Southern California up to Ananda Village, like a golden thread that was tying me there. And there were all these demons, and they were bouncing on it, trying to break it. I mean, maybe this was fever delirium, I don't know. But it was all so vivid, I could just see them, ting, 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 like this, just doing what they could to snap it. And if they'd been able to snap it, I might have said that. Who knows? You might be seeing a whole other person up here at this time. But I was tied. There was a thread that went from my heart into my spiritual life. My thread goes very strongly to Swamiji, through Swamiji to Master, and because I was on that thread, you might say, and dragged is not the right word, but dragged is also the right word. I was dragged to Ananda. I had to stay at Ananda because that's where my thread held me. And then Swami reeled it out and threw us out to Palo Alto, so the thread got a little longer. You know, all of those different ways. Now, thinking back about the life of Jesus, and the way our spiritual life grows, we all have this thread. We are all children of God. We are all tied to the Father by this golden thread. I know psychics talk about the soul and many different things, and it's an image many people use, but I feel it just like that. Just like a leash, but a very beautiful one. And no matter how far we ourselves wander, no matter how far we decide, I'm sick of this. I want God, but only a little bit. Oh Lord, please live within me, but not perhaps in this part. I'll do anything you ask except these 10 things, right? Or reverse, I'll do anything you ask as long as it's these 10 things. Like that. But the thread is always there, and we cannot actually sever it. I mean, the demons can stretch it. They can stretch it pretty far, and they can make it so thin that we forget. But it's always there. And when we begin to wake up, when we have for example, incredible good karma, to be on the streets of Jerusalem, when Jesus comes through, God is always reeling that thread in. And we would find ourselves, as they found themselves then, they had no choice. Suddenly, for that moment in time, Jesus allowed who he was. He did battle with darkness on the open field. Much of the time, Jesus kept himself hidden. He had to. You had to be able to find him because it was the nature of the time, and in order for his work to succeed in the sense of endure, as it has done until this present moment, it had to have deep roots. You couldn't be a Christian just because everyone else was, all my friends believe, so I believe, right? You had to really know. Except this one extraordinary moment when everyone, suddenly that thread was pulling them. And when the Pharisees said to him, silence them, it's not appropriate that they should be praising you in this way. Jesus' response, and it's such an extraordinary, everything's so truncated in the Bible, but it's extraordinary. If I closed their mouths, the cry of exultation would come out of the very earth. The stones themselves would declare my divinity. That's not what he said, but that's what he implied, because it was there to happen. And in the meantime, all those who had a thread to him, at least for that moment, were pulled in with him. And they thought this was going to be it, that the trip from here to heaven was going to be now just this straight line behind the power of this man. And it is a straight line behind the power of this man, but it is not the paved road of worldly power. It's the golden road of the heart's intuition. And that's the thread that's really holding us, that just doesn't allow us Even if we stretch it out and wander even for incarnations, we can never cut it free. That's why that moment in my parents' house was so fascinating to me. Look, here it is. This is, everyone thinks this is a reasonable choice. Everyone, except the only people in the world to me who really know. And thank God, I'm tied to them. When Señor Cuaron, who was a disciple of Master, a Mexican man, between himself and his guru, Master had said that for a while Señor Cuaron had wandered away. And the way Master put it to him, I lost sight of you for a few lifetimes, but I'll never lose sight of you again. And what was so dear about it, apparently this man, he was a big man, a successful man, and Master was this small fellow. But Señor Cuaron would say to Master often, don't forget your promise. Just imagine what a heart full of sorrow was behind that. What would it have been like to have been that close and then to have become so confused as to wander away and then find your way back? Never forget your promise to me. Cuaron would remind Master, and Master would say, I won't forget. I'll never lose sight of you again. So we have lived who knows how many lifetimes. And someone asked the question, as people often ask, do I need a living master? Can I be a disciple of Yogananda if he's not here? Can I be a disciple of Jesus? And I think of it like this. Self-realized masters don't have to incarnate as often as we do. So the mathematics of it say we're going to have a lot of incarnations in which the master is not going to be embodied with us. And if every time we find ourselves incarnated again, we look for somebody else, we're not really going to get very far. Because the limiting factor is not the capacity of the guru to hold on to that thread and pull you into the light. The limiting capacity is this little bit of free will that only the wise can discern that cause us, just have you seen children? Sometimes parents actually put their children on these strings. Every time I see a child in one of those little harnesses, I think, what drove the mother to this? But and this is, or you're just, the child is being pulled by the hand, and the child is like so uninterested in going where mommy wants you to go. There's that kind of tripping walk that children get when they're being dragged. You know what it is? And they're just over here like this, and they're all twisted up. That's how Master has us. He's got us on that thread, and the heart knows. The heart really knows, but it knows a lot of other things too. It definitely wants that thread to hold, but it wants to do a little sightseeing on the way. So Jesus dragged us all into Jerusalem. Many of us, I'm sure, in other physical bodies, we were dragged into Jerusalem. Some of us, perhaps, went eagerly. But one way or another, the compelling power of that light overcame all other resistance, and we were there. And he dragged us into that light because an enormous cloud was about to descend. And every devotee, symbolically still, but explicitly through this amazing story, it's like, what am I following? What do I believe? How much courage do I have in the face of it? How much of God in my heart can I really accept? How much do I want? And how much will I let in? And this is the great, magnificent opportunity that Easter gives us every year, is that we get to start again and ask ourselves that question and just see how much we can open to that light.